Still, it's good that we don't live in the Middle Ages. Why? I'll tell you now. Well, if ever your children start whining again about how hard life is for them, show them this video. Today, this child is a little emperor, both in his family and in society as a whole. And in the Middle Ages, children were treated so differently that a French historian who studied the history of childhood in various eras, Philippe Aries, even came to the conclusion that children were not valued and disliked at all at that time. Today we will tell you such details about medieval childhood, from which you will be shocked. Why is childhood in the Middle Ages a real hell? Why were babies sent to wet nurses? Why were even cradles deadly? And why did you sleep sitting down then? Why was it the norm to give their kids to be raised in other people's families? Turn 7, go to work. And was there even a special holiday on which it was supposed to beat their children? And is it true that even the King of France was terrified of Rosk? Yes, childhood ends today. According to the legislation, 18. For some, never at all. But in the Middle Ages it ended at 7. At 7, Karl. At this age, the surviving child was already considered a small adult, an employee, or a worker. In general, another breadwinner in the family. In poor families, they were sent to work and study in the service of artisans, well, or for education. Moreover, 7-year-olds worked on a par with adults, but they paid less. What can we say about the Middle Ages, if working children of 7 years old were the norm in Europe some 3 centuries ago? During the rapid growth of industrial capitalism, 7-year-olds were forced to plow for 12 to 14 hours a day in stuffy rooms, and there was no lunch break, cartoons, educational games, English and outdoor games. So, 7 years old, that's it, you're free, go earn your own bread. But even before 7, the children were not such a little king in the house. They worked hard, only at home. 3-year-olds were already cleaning up, helping adults feed cattle, washing dishes. 5-year-olds replaced adults with might and main, looked after the younger ones, worked in the fields together with adults. In Icelandic sagas, it is often said even about very young boys who are lucky for their murdered fathers. And even at the age of 7, the children were already, in general, the progenitors of the genus. A few more years and it's time to officially get married. For girls, the official age is 12, for boys, 14. However, noble girls could still be married off, albeit without consummation. There were also such cases. In general, a real horror. Children deprived of childhood. Children began to bear full criminal responsibility, up to the death penalty, from the age of 10 or 11. That's such a happy childhood. No wonder some French researchers believed that the very term of childhood in our usual understanding was discovered and realized by mankind only in the era of modern times, and in the Middle Ages there was simply no place for childhood. This explains the complete indifference of artists in the Middle Ages to the 12th century to this topic. That is, no one had any memories of a happy childhood in the Middle Ages. As the historian Philippe Aries writes, the stay in the family and in society as a child was too brief and too insignificant for there to be time or reason to remember it or to awaken feelings towards this period. As for intimate life, in the Middle Ages, children were also savvy Smolenov. In medieval Europe, ordinary people's beds appeared quite late, only in the 14th and 16th centuries. And for a long time the poor slept in vain. And in wealthier families who had beds, in one bed with the whole big family. Do you remember the fairy tale about Tom Thumb? It's warmer this way. This practice existed among all classes. For example, for the Irish it looked like this, away from the doors, at the very wall, the eldest daughter and the rest of the girls on her, in the middle of the mother and father, further sons, and from the very edge of the old people were guests at home. Interestingly, this manner of sleeping lasted almost until the 20th century. The description of the life of British farmers of the 19th century has come down to our times. The whole family and their servants slept in one huge bed, leaving room in it even for guests. That's it. By the way, in one of the books of that time, the author describes how to arrange such a bed for several people as much as 3 meters wide. And here is an old bed of commoners. Don't you think that, on the contrary, it is too small? Yes, the thing is that at that time they slept in beds half-sitting, with pillows under their backs, because they believed that only the dead could lie in a horizontal position. Well, in the late Middle Ages in Britain they began to sleep in such cabinets. It was much warmer in it, and finally it was possible to hide from unnecessary, including children's eyes. However, parents did not really try to shield their children from unnecessary spectacles. So, their own kids were taken to the spectacle of public executions. It was believed that this is a very useful activity, as it cleanses from filth. And finally, I'll tell you about what sounds really wild to us. A Venetian in London at the end of the 14th century was simply amazed by the attitude of the British towards their own children. Until the age of 7 or 9, the child grew up with his parents, after which he was sent to be raised in someone else's family, regardless of the social and financial situation of the family. Yes, their own blood was put out of the house and sent to strangers, where they would no longer regret. This custom was incredibly widespread throughout Europe and even survived until almost the 18th century. Moreover, it was customary for everyone to give their children to be raised by strangers, both the poor and the rich. Well, in exchange, you also had to take someone else's children into your own house, whom you could drive and exploit. So, as a result, the family did not participate in the socialization of children at all. You say, how is it so? But it was simply believed that in someone else's house the child would behave better than his parents. Here in the 14th century, the Florentine merchant Paul of Certal advises, if you have a son who is good for nothing, hand him over to a merchant so that someone will send him to distant countries or send him to one of his close friends. There's nothing to be done. As long as your son stays with you, he will not find a use for himself in life. Aristocrats gave their children to be raised by wealthy relatives or to establish close ties between clans. The townspeople gave their 7-year-old child to artisans for training. Poor children had it so hard with strangers. In one of the letters, the boy complained, all the pleasure that I knew as a child from 3 to 10 years old, while I was under the care of my mother-father, was replaced by torment and pain. Well, what if you were starving? In the Middle Ages, it was quite a common way to sell your child. Can you imagine how wild it is? Such a right is claimed by the fathers, for example, historical monuments of German medieval legislation. Of course, we are talking about extreme cases, during famine, for example. This was also the case in the Saxon cities. As the same historian Philip Aliasov writes, the whole point is that the family did not have an emotional function at that time. It doesn't mean that I didn't have love. On the contrary, you meet with love very often. Sometimes after an engagement, more often after a wedding, when love was created and maintained by living together. But we emphasize that feelings between spouses, between parents and children were not necessary either for the existence of the family or for harmony in it. If the feeling did appear, it was just an additional plus. Apparently, it is rare. Not a century in the first months of life, from a quarter to a third of all children died, about 40% did not live to the age of 9 at all. According to researchers, because of this, parents had such a strange callousness towards young children, too many died. People couldn't get too attached to someone who was so easy to lose. This also explains the words of the famous Michel Antenne, I lost 2 or 3 in infancy. It's not that I don't regret them, but I don't grumble. Philippe Aries writes, someone could worry, but the general rules were not to pay too much attention to it, because soon someone else would appear in his place. The child, in a sense, remained anonymous. Historians demographers recognized the long-existing indifference towards their own children. In medieval family diaries, children and their deaths are rarely mentioned at all. And even later in relation to the Middle Ages, in the 17th century, one neighbor, the wife of an official, so comforted a friend who had lost a child, before they were able to give you a lot of trouble, you would lose half, and if not all. Agree, a strange consolation. If you think that the famine epidemic is the only danger that was waiting for children then again, be mistaken. The most common causes of death of children, judging by the lives of saints and coroners' reports, were suffocation, burns from boiling water and drowning. Do you know why suffocation? Mothers could just fall asleep at babies. And these are not the fears of young mothers, but, it seems, a harsh reality. In the medieval manual for the absolution of sins, the priest was recommended to ask parishioners without fail, did you run over your child in a dream? Some bishops so vehemently forbade parents to take babies to bed, something has led modern researchers to suspect. But was it premeditated murder? Even baby cots posed a serious threat to babies. The ripples were suspended from the ceiling. As a result, whether due to the carelessness of the nurse, who could rock the cradle very much, or due to her oversight, babies often fell out of it and crashed to death or remained disabled for life. This was also a serious factor in child mortality. But in noble families, according to the Franciscan monk Berthold of Regensburg in one of his sermons, another danger awaited the children. They often died from overeating, as numerous relatives stuffed the baby with food, while the poor starved. However, death was accompanied by the consciousness of a medieval man from birth. Regarding the death of a child who has not reached the age of 7, there was not even a provision for an arrest. That's for sure about the times he rava. But such a familiar admiration and obsession with mothers' children, in the opinion of researchers, appears only in the Renaissance, which is also manifested in portraits of women with babies, which became popular in this era. But in the medieval way it is a complete paralysis. It was customary to swaddle poor babies very tightly, like mummies. Famous doctors of the Middle Ages assured that otherwise the child would develop incorrectly. Unpacking babies was strictly 3 or 4 times a day, no more often, to wipe with a cloth for hygiene and again tightly pack in a cocoon. Yes, you heard right, wipe. I quote, if the ass is very dirty, you can wash it by wiping it with a sponge or linen cloth, moistened with a small amount of water and wine, writes Jacques Guillaume in the treatise Happy Childbirth in 1612. That's why the mortality rate was high. Often children died before they reached the age of 1. Dr. Aldobrandini and Siena in the 1254th in the treatise The Bodily Charter also recommend that before wrapping the poor fellow, cover the child with rose petals and rub salt, because the child acquires any shape like wax. Such a tight swaddling with salt was simply necessary for the future beauty of the child. It was believed that an experienced nanny, tying tight, literally sculpts a handsome child out of a child. To quote the same Aldobrandini, for this reason, you should know that beauty and ugliness are largely due to babysitters. In the opinion of another medieval encyclopedist Bartolomeo of England, it is also necessary to capture children in the same way, because otherwise the child's organs will move inside the body, because they have not yet been fixed as needed, and as a result they will be alone in their places. Here is such an encyclopedist. But to top it off, the poor babies, who could not even move like that, were put on special caps with planks that tightly pressed their ears to their heads. It's hardly pleasant when your head is always squeezed, as in a vice. But the colors of the clothes will surprise you. To quote a medieval source, pure white is used for all babies, blue for girls and pink for boys. And if you want a color, that's it, it's the opposite. Such rules were followed in Europe until the 20th century. Well, children up to 6 or 7 years old did not use the pot. So much for hygiene. One extremely strange custom is to give your own babies to wet nurses. Even when the Middle Ages had long since ended, in the year 1780, the head of the Paris police wrote in a report, every year 21,000 children are born in the city, 17,000 of them, the absolute majority, are sent to nurses in the village, 2,000 or 3 are sent to homes for babies, 700 are nursed by nurses in the parents' house. And only 700 out of 21,000 children are breastfed by their own mothers. Here is such a statistic. The thing is that doctors, it turns out, categorically forbade mothers to breastfeed their children on their own for 2 weeks after birth. So, Dr. Bartholomeus Metlinger quite seriously stated that the whole point is that the mother's milk has not yet had time to brew and acquire useful properties. Moreover, it could even be poisonous to a child. Can you imagine what nonsense? To prevent the baby from being poisoned, they hired professional nurses from among those who nursed their own child for at least 6 weeks before taking care of yours. But if you, out of your unreasonableness, still want to feed your child yourself, well, let me suck your very first wolf's milk. But if for some reason they haven't got her yet, as a last resort, dogs. If the animal survives, then you can start feeding yourself. Here is such a strange tradition. So, the Middle Ages are no Montessori, early reading, and so on. Although there was one educational method, to beat a child, and the harder, the better. It's creepy. Here in the 12th century, the Crusader knight Philip of Navarre's essay The 4 Ages of Man advises, you should not show your great love to the child, as he may become proud of it and start acting badly. And when he sees that he is starting to act badly, he needs to be severely punished and dismissed, and if he does not calm down then, he should be whipped with a whip, and if this does not work, he should be put in prison. It was believed that punishment had an exclusively healing role for a small person, as it was weaned from bad deeds. What a horror. So the historian of the 11th-12th centuries, Guibert Nogansky, known for his autobiographical writings, recalled, he, the teacher, showered me almost every day with a hail of slaps and kicks to force me to understand what he could not explain himself. Interestingly, the historian himself is sure that it was useful. There was even such a day, the 28th of December, declared the Day of the Holy Innocents. On this strange holiday, parents were obliged to beat their own children. And in Russia, the famous Domostroy forbids even playing and laughing with his own child and emphasizes, whether the son and Masha will not finish in the thread in his youth, but crush his ribs. And don't feel sorry for the baby. If you punish him with a rod, he will not die, but he will be healthier, because by executing his body, you save his soul from death. If you have a daughter and direct your severity at her, you will save her from bodily troubles. As a result, children were mercilessly beaten up until the 20th century just for education. Even the kings were not saved from this. So, the same king of the Three Musketeers, Louis XIII, often woke up in horror at night, waiting for the morning flogging, as in childhood. When he was crowned at the age of 8, he was flogged so much before that he declared, I'd rather do without all these honors, so long as I didn't get flogged. Can you imagine? Here is such a childhood on medieval coins.